Good morning. One person said so. Yeah. Open your Bibles to Daniel chapter 11. Daniel chapter 11. We are getting closer and closer to the end of the book of Daniel. When we finish this, which I hope will be in a couple of weeks, we're going to move into a study of the life of Christ. So something similar to a harmony of the Gospels, looking at Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, kind of in a chronological order. So that'll be coming up when we get through with this. Daniel chapter 11 is a fascinating chapter to me. And it is so accurate in some of its prophecies that there has been a big move amongst liberal scholars to date it about 150 BC. They will tell you that, of course, their starting point is there's no such thing as inspiration. There's no such thing as predictive prophecy. And so their idea is, well, since that doesn't occur, this book could not have been written in 536, had to be written in about 150. And whoever wrote it attached Daniel's name to it, kind of forged Daniel's name to it so that everybody would think that Daniel wrote it. Some of the things they go through to try to get around inspiration and to try to get around the accuracy to predict the prophecies of the Bible are really very interesting to me. In Daniel chapter 1, remember the children of Israel are at this time under control of the Medo-Persian Empire. They've been taken away from Jerusalem by the Babylonians. They've been carried into captivity. The Babylonians have been overtaken by the Medo-Persians in 536. Cyrus had issued a decree that allowed the Jews to go home. About 50 to 60,000 of them had gone back to Jerusalem. And that's where they are when these things began to occur. Daniel chapter 11 verse 1. Many scholars think chapter 11 verse 1 actually belongs to the end of chapter 10. I try to remind people from time to time, you need to remember when Daniel wrote Daniel, he didn't write Daniel chapter 1, verse 1, verse 2, verse 3. This is all written as one letter, one book. And man came through several hundred years later and decided we need to divide it up into chapters so it's easier. Can you imagine finding Daniel 7 if there are no chapters and there are no verses? It's just one long letter. And so it was divided up into chapters and verses to make it easier to find and easier to get through. Sometimes they put those chapter divisions in the exact wrong place. No paragraphs, you're right. And in original Hebrew, there were no vowels. It was all consonants, and get this, it was written backwards. Hebrew was written from this side of the page to this side of the page, not here. They went that way. I studied about 3 months of Hebrew in college and decided I'd had enough. I was tickled to death to get out of there with a C. And so a little bit different. As for me, in the first year of Darius the Mede, I stood up to confirm and strengthen him. And so you've got Daniel, it says here in the first year of Darius, it was the first year that he ruled in Babylon. It was not the first year of the Babylonian Empire. I mean, the Medo-Persian Empire. It's the first year after they had taken over Babylon, which had been 536, 535. And Daniel says he stood up to confirm and strengthen him. That is, he was working in Darius' government, supporting him, and trying to get the Jews to submit to him. Verse 2, this angel is speaking, and he said, "Now I will show you the truth. Behold, 3 more kings shall arise in Persia, and a 4th shall be far richer than all of them. He shall become strong through his riches. He shall stir up against the kingdom of Greece. Then a mighty king shall arise, who shall rule with great dominion, and do so as he wills." Now, actually, in those first 4 verses, you're covering several hundred years of history. It's kind of just a quick summation to get into what he really wants to talk about. He said that when Cyrus was reigning, when this was being talked about, he said after Cyrus there will be 3 more kings. Now actually there were several more kings than 3. He skipped a whole bunch. There were 3 that were kind of important in their connection to the Jews, and in telling this story that he's about to tell. Cyrus was king. Following Cyrus was his son by the name of Cambyses. Cambyses was followed by a man by the name of Pseudo-Smyrtus. Pseudo means fake Smyrtus. He claimed to be Smyrtus when he wasn't. Darius in 522 and Xerxes in 486. Now, does anybody have an idea who Xerxes is?
Esther's husband.
Esther. Called Ahasuerus and Esther. It's Xerxes. That's where we've gotten to when you look at Xerxes. Notice it says, he shall be far richer than all of them, which shall become strong through his riches. He shall stir up all against the kingdom of Greece. Xerxes' father, Darius I, had first attacked Greece in an attempt to take Greece. He got defeated, he had to go back home. When Xerxes became king, his idea was, I'm going to avenge the loss of my father. I'm going after Greece. He raised an army of close to 3 million soldiers. Now, if you think about it for a moment, that's going to cost a lot of money. You got to feed those 3 million soldiers. You got to clothe those 3 million soldiers. You got to provide equipment for those 3 million soldiers. You got to pay for that's going to be expensive. And so Xerxes had amassed a great deal of wealth. Remember in the book of Esther, when it opens, he threw a banquet that lasted 6 months. Now you talk about throwing a party nowadays for that many people. You know, if you do it for one day, it costs out. Can you imagine doing one for 6 months? Brad?
For a wider context, Darius fought Greece in the Battle of Marathon, where he ran in 26 miles and into Athens and said Nike and fell over and died. Xerxes went and fought the Greeks, and that's the last battle of the 300.
Yeah.
It's kind of a famous where 300 Spartans held off 3 million Persians for a few days.
It really was, and it really was a big case of what we today would refer to as David and Goliath. The Greeks had to be considered a great underdog simply because of the size of the mass of the army. What it boiled down to is the Greeks were better at tactics. They were better at fighting war. If you know what you're doing, if you know how to set up your soldiers, you know how to attack and how to do those things, a small number of well-trained soldiers can outdo a larger army. It's happened time after time in history. So it's not really that much of a shock. Xerxes was defeated at Thermopylae and at Salamis, but there was kind of from Darius' point at about 530, 525, 520, all the way to Alexander the Great, which is almost 200 years. There was an ongoing kind of skirmish and battle going on between Greece and Medo-Persia. But Xerxes, that fourth king we talked about, Xerxes was at the height of the Medo-Persian Empire. He was the wealthiest king, he was the most powerful king, and after he went away, he was in many ways such a wasteful guy that the Medo-Persian Empire actually began to decline after Xerxes' death and became much weaker and weaker and weaker and weaker. So the kings that followed Xerxes were not nearly like the kings that were in front of him. And Daniel just kind of skipped all those. Notice he says, verse 3, this Xerxes, he will stir up against the kingdom of Greece. Then a mighty king shall arise who shall rule with great dominion and do as he wills. And as soon as he has arisen, the kingdom shall be broken and divided toward the four winds of heaven, but not to his posterity, nor according to the authority which he ruled. for his kingdom shall be plucked up and go to others beside these. Okay, Xerxes stirred up all these people against Greece. He attacked Greece. When he says in verse 3, a mighty king shall arise, who shall rule with great dominion, who's he talking about? Alexander the Great. How do you know that? Read the next verse. As soon as he has arisen, his kingdom shall be broken and divided toward the four winds of heaven. What happened when Alexander the Great died to Alexander the Great's kingdom? Divided into four sections. Notice it not only says that, four winds of heaven, but not to his posterity. His descendants did not reign. When Alexander the Great died, he was married to a lady by the name of Roxana, who was a Medo-Persian princess. She was pregnant with a young son. He ended up being born and being named Alexander the Fourth. Those four generals took that kingdom. They were supposed to hold it for this young boy until he got old enough. He was going to take Alexander the Great's place. He was going to be the new king. At 14, Alexander the Fourth was poisoned, along with his mother. And so Alexander the Great's posterity ended because his only child was killed. These generals kind of got jealous of him. Gary, did I put a map on the very beginning of that? Go back to the very first slide. I wanted to show you something for just a minute if we can get back to it. If you see that slide up near the left-hand side that says Lysimachus, that's one of his generals. That's the part of Alexander the Great's empire he ruled. Just underneath that in red, you see the name Cassander. That's the part that he ruled. Go over here to the far left, Seleucus. In Daniel chapter 11, you can hear a great deal about the king of the north. That's who he's talking about. He's talking about the Seleucids. The Seleucid dynasty. On the very bottom of that map to the left is Ptolemy. That is Egypt. That's the fourth general. Those are the four generals that took Alexander the Great's kingdom. Now, we get into the end, further in Daniel chapter 11, you hear a great deal about the king of the north, who are Seleucids, and the king of the south, who are the Ptolemies. Now, if you go from Ptolemy to Seleucid, where you got to go? All this over here to the left of Jerusalem, that's all desert. To get from Egypt to the Seleucid Empire, where you got to go? Got to go right through Israel. When you were a kid, I used to do this to my brothers and sisters all the time. Did you ever play a game where there's one of you sitting on this and one of you sitting on the other and one sitting in the middle? And the two on the end said, "You want to see a fight between us?" And the guy in the middle said, "Yeah," and you start beating on him. That's that. The Seleucids to the north, Ptolemies to the south. Every time they went at each other, guess where they met? Israel is right in the middle of it. They're right in the middle of it. And that's why a lot of this is being talked about. But his kingdom shall be plucked up and shall go to others besides thee. Then, verse 5, the king of the south will be strong. One of his princes shall be stronger than he, and rule, and his authority shall be a great authority. So you've got the king of the south, the Ptolemies, the king of the north. At the very beginning, the Ptolemies are more powerful. They're reigning, and they're ruling over, they've got control of Palestine. They've got control of Judah. And there was a truce. Notice he says in verse 6, after some years they shall make an alliance. The daughter of the king of the south shall come to the king of the north to make an agreement. The Ptolemy in the south, the Seleucid in the north at that time, the Ptolemy's daughter married the Seleucid king in an attempt to form an alliance. We're going to stop this fighting. We're going to agree to be with one another. And so, unfortunately, what happened, the king of the north, whose name was Antiochus, was already married. He was married to a girl by the name of Laodicea. Now, I know you've heard of Laodicea before. It's in the book of Revelation. It's a city. But Antiochus divorced Laodicea to marry Bernice, who was the Ptolemy's daughter. Then Laodicea, now this gets a little, it's almost like a soap opera. Laodicea poisons Berenice and Berenice's son. She doesn't like the fact that she's not queen anymore. So she removes the queen and the queen's son and puts her son in charge. And so now Callinicus becomes the new king of the north. But the king of the south, down in Egypt, who had given his daughter, his son becomes king. And so now his idea is, I'm going to get vengeance for my sister who was just murdered. After some years I shall make an alliance, and the king of the south shall come to the king of the north and make an agreement, but she shall not retain the strength of her arm, and his arm shall not endure, but she shall be given up, and their attendants, he who fathered her, and he who supported those in those times. So she's going to become the queen of the north. She's going to be married. That's not going to last. Her power is not going to last. Verse 7, and from a branch from her roots, one shall arise in his place. He shall come against the army and enter the fortress of the king of the north, and he shall deal with them and shall prevail. So this Ptolemy comes up from the south to avenge his sister's death. He goes to battle against the king of the north, and he wins. Laodicea, who had murdered his daughter, he slaughters. And so this ongoing war between Egypt and the Seleucids, with Palestine in the middle, lasts for about 200 years. It's just back and forth all the time. Ptolemy III took Antioch. He killed Laodicea. He took Babylon and headed toward India. He got part of the way there. He decided to go back to Egypt. He took a bunch of plunder with him and signed a treaty with Egypt that lasted for 10 years. So for 10 years they're not fighting. Then a new king in the north arises by the name of Antiochus III. He decides he wants to attack, he's going to get revenge, he's going to attack Egypt. So now we've got another battle. Now it's the king of the north coming. He, unfortunately for him, doesn't win. He goes back home. He spends a few years stewing and trying to rebuild it. And so in verses 11 through 13, you have where Antiochus raised a great army, but Ptolemy first defeated him, but then Ptolemy got arrogant. And in 202 BC, Antiochus defeated Ptolemy V. And then the Seleucids take control of Palestine. We've got the Ptolemy stronger for a while. Now you've got the Seleucids stronger for a while. The Jews revolted against the Ptolemies and aligned themselves with the Seleucids, which they're going to end up regretting sometime later. Antiochus III, who is the king of the north, then gives his daughter to Ptolemy as a spy, as a wife, but he wants to use her as a spy. I get my daughter in there, I can kind of control Egypt too. Interesting thing is, Antiochus' daughter was named Cleopatra. Now, it's not the Cleopatra you're thinking about. It's not the one in Egypt when Rome came into power that had the fling with Marcus and Julius Caesar. It's an ancestor of hers. But it's just interesting to me, that's the first time you come across the name Cleopatra. And it wasn't an Egyptian name. It was a Syrian name. Her husband Antiochus III, tried to invade Greece. The interesting thing, he was stopped by the Romans. It's a very interesting story. Antiochus was outside of the cities of Egypt, and the Roman, envoy for the Roman Senate met him and said, "You're not going into Egypt, Rome's not going to let you." And Antiochus said, "Let me think about this for a while. Let me decide what I want to do." And the Roman envoy drew a circle around him in the dirt. And before you step out of that circle, you're going to make up your mind. He went back home. A few years later, he went to in Jerusalem. Antiochus III did, where he was accepted as a deliverer because he threw off the Egyptian bondage. They thought they were better off without Egypt. Verse 17. He shall set his face to come with the strength of the whole kingdom. He shall bring terms of agreement and perform them. He shall give the daughter of women to destroy the kingdom, but it shall not stand or be to his advantage. Afterward he shall turn his face to the coastland and shall capture many of them. But a commander shall put an end to his insolence, and indeed he shall turn his insolence back upon him. He shall turn his face toward the fortress of his own land. He shall stumble and fall, and it shall not be found. He gave his daughter to Ptolemy to marry, thought that would give him, but that didn't work. He then ended up going back home. He fought some against the coastland, that is against some of the islands of the Mediterranean, but the Roman army stopped him. And then he starts to go back home. Notice verse 19. It says, he shall turn his face toward the fortress of his own land. He shall stumble and fall, and shall not be found. According to historical records, Antiochus III tried to raid a temple in the city of Elymais. I'm not sure how you pronounce it. It's Elymas. And he was killed in that attempt. Unfortunately, one of the things that a lot of those ancient kings did, they had a lot of respect for temples because they were considered to be dwelling places of God. And temples were considered most times to be safe places. Most generals would not sack temples. Now, there were a few exceptions to that. Most of them did not. When he went to he raided this temple not because he was trying to defeat them in battle, because he wanted the money. The temples were not only temples, they were storehouses. That's where nations sold all their wealth. I haven't even been by, but I've been by Fort Knox in Kentucky, where that gold deposit thing is. You can't get within 5 miles of that place. But that temples were where they stored all their treasures. When they defeated another country and took all their plunder, they put it in a temple. And so normally when you're into a temple, you found a lot of good stuff. And so he went and raided that temple to get money. And he lost. Then shall arise in his place one who shall send an exactor of tribute for the glory of the kingdom. When a few days he shall be broken, neither in anger nor in battle. Antiochus III died. He was replaced by his son, who then took an exactor. The exactor of tribute is a tax collector. He sent a tax collector to Jerusalem to raid the temple because he needed the money. The tax collector, Heliodorus is his name, said that he saw a vision. And because of that vision, he would not raid the temple. He went back to Antioch and killed the king, and he became the king. Heliodorus became king. Now, this is where you come into a very important man when you come to Jewish history. Heliodorus got into a fight with Antiochus IV. He's referred to as Antiochus Epiphanes. You need to remember that name. Antiochus Epiphanes is a very important name in Jewish history. Don't read about him in the Bible, but you read about him in the instances between, or the history between the Testaments. Antiochus Epiphanes was the nephew of Antiochus III. He was not in line to be king, but he took it. Notice it says, in his place shall rise a contemptible person to whom royal majesty has not been given. He shall come in without warning, obtain the kingdom by flatteries. armies shall be utterly swept away before him, and broken, even the prince of the covenant. What is the prince, that verse 22, what is the prince of the covenant? First of all, what's the covenant? I didn't think that was a hard of a question. What's the covenant in the Old Law, in the Old Testament? The Old Law. The Law of Moses. You're talking about the children of Israel. Who is the prince of the covenant?
High priest.
The high priest. And so he said, armies shall be broken before him, even the prince of the covenant. Even the high priest got involved. It was long about this time that the office of the high priest changed from being a religious position to being a political position. During Antiochus Epiphanes' time as king of the north, the high priesthood was sold 3 times. And from that time an alliance is made with him. He shall act deceitfully. He shall become strong with a small people. Without warning he shall come into the richest parts of the province. He shall do what neither his father nor his father's fathers have done, scattering among them spoil and goods. He shall devise plans against strongholds, but only for a time. He did what his grandfathers had not done, because he attacked Judah. His attempt was, Antiochus Epiphanes was raised in Greece. He fell in love with Grecian culture. His attempt was to force the Jews to become Greeks. He built a gymnasium in the city of Jerusalem. You and I think of a gymnasium, we think of something totally different. A gymnasium in Greek times, when they went there, they played games, but they played games naked. Immorality, nudity. The Jews, of course, based on old law, were not supposed to participate in that. But many of them did. They also had a medical procedure that many of them would undergo that would try to hide the fact that they were circumcised, because they wanted to fit in with the rest of Greek culture. So you've got a section of Jews who are trying to remain faithful to the law. You've got a section of Jews who are trying to compromise with the Greeks. If you look at the New Testament, who does that remind you of? Pharisees, Sadducees. The time of Antiochus Epiphanes was actually when the Pharisees and the Sadducees began. Strict adherence to the law, liberal interpretation of the law. That's where it all began. Those who were liberal decided they needed to go along to get along. They needed to fit in with the crowd. They needed to fit in with Antiochus Epiphanes' power, and so that's the way they went. The conservatives, no, we've got to stick to the law. And the beginning of the Pharisee part, that's really what they did. It later became something totally different than that. Verse 25, he shall stir up against his power and his heart against the king of the south with a great army. The king of the south shall wage war with an exceeding great army, but he shall not stand, for plot shall be devised against him. Antiochus Epiphanes attacked Egypt again, and at that time Egypt was divided amongst 2 different Ptolemies, 2 different rulers. And Antiochus kind of won that battle. His army shall be swept away, and many shall fall. As for the 2 kings, their hearts shall be bent on doing evil. They shall speak lies at the same table, but to no avail. Antiochus Epiphanes and the king of the south were gathered to negotiate to make a peace treaty. Neither one of them were being honest. They were speaking with, as we used to say, speaking with forked tongue. And so the agreement didn't work. He shall return to his land, but with great wealth. That is Antiochus Epiphanes. But his heart shall be set against the holy covenant. He shall work his will and return to his own land. Verse 30, the ships of Kittim shall come against him. That again is wrong. He shall be afraid and withdraw, and shall turn back and be arranged, and shall take action against the holy covenant. Now, he goes to Egypt. The Romans run him out of Egypt. He's going back home. He's going back home. How do you think he's feeling going back home? Mad. And he takes out his anger on Jerusalem. He goes into the city of Jerusalem. He takes the temple itself. He builds an altar to Zeus, who is the Roman god, or the Greek god, on top of the great altar that the Jews offered sacrifices on. And then he offered a pig on that altar. The temple has now been desecrated in two ways. There's an idol god in that temple, and an unclean animal has been offered on that altar. Which means what? They couldn't offer sacrifices on it. The temple's been desecrated. It's been made unclean. And you can read through the history and find a little bit more details. But you go through all this, and eventually what happened is there was an older Jew by the name of Mattathias Maccabeus in one of the small towns outside of Jerusalem. One of the envoys of Antiochus Epiphanes went there to try to get him to offer a sow on an altar, and he refused. And there actually started in that little town, I think it's named Modin, that's where the Maccabean War started. Mattathias Maccabeus revolted against the envoy of the Syrian army, and that envoy was eventually killed. Mattathias was an old man at that time. His younger son by the name of Judas became the leader of the Maccabeans. He's called Judas the Hammerer. If you go, I don't know, maybe there is a section of books, it's called the Apocrypha, that Catholics include in their Bible that we don't because they're not inspired. Well, there are two books in that Apocrypha that's called 1st and 2nd Maccabees. And they're the history of the Maccabean period. And there's a lot of information, and there's also a lot of information if you read from Josephus, the Jewish historian, about this Maccabean period. 168 BC, the temple was desecrated. Judas knew he couldn't defeat Syria on an open field, too big of an army. So he became a practice of what we refer to as guerrilla warfare. He would hit here and run, and hit here and run, and hit here and run, and hit here and run. He'd wait till the Syrian army split, and he'd go after the smaller group. And believe it or not, within several years, he had basically run the Syrians out of Palestine. And in 165 BC, he rededicated the temple. Purified it, cleansed it, did what he had to do to make it exciting, and they started offering sacrifices again. Have any of you ever heard of a Jewish feast called the Feast of Dedication? Jesus talked about it in the book of John. That's what he's talking about. When the Maccabeans rededicated the temple, they set aside a feast day that was celebrated from then on to remember what the Maccabeans had done in rededicating that temple. Now, I haven't really gone verse by verse in this chapter, but that's really, he tried to force the Jews to become Greeks. And through their own dedication to God, their own dedication to the law, their own dedication to trying to be right, they ended up defeating the Syrians. And they never did really have a big on-field face-to-face battle where they actually defeated the Syrians in a big battle. They just, all these little battles and all these little wars that the Syrians just kind of got tired of fiddling with it and went home. But you end up looking at this chapter. In verse 33, verse 2, he shall seduce with flattery those who violate the covenant, but the people who know their God shall stand firm and take action. And the wise among the people shall make many understand, though for some days they shall stumble by sword and flame. There are a lot of the Maccabean people people following the Maccabees who died in fighting the Syrians. They spent a lot, they tried to stand up for the truth. They tried to teach what was right to the Jews so that they too would stand up for the truth. When they stumble, they shall receive a little help, and many shall join themselves to them with flattery. There were some who joined the Maccabees out of flattery. As they weren't being sincere, they saw the Maccabees were going to win, so they jumped in. I also think, and this is, I'm getting into my own opinion here, and you can do what you want to with it. I think the Maccabees were helped by God. Because they were trying to stand for the purity of the covenant and purity of the law. Now I realize I can't prove that. That's not an inspired scripture. But when it says they shall receive a little help, I kind of think that's what it's talking about. You drop down to verse 37, back talking about Antiochus. He shall pay no attention to the gods of his fathers or the one to be loved by women. He shall not pay attention to any god, for he shall magnify himself above all. Antiochus Epiphanes had a gold coin minted. And on the back of that coin said Antiochus Theos. Now, if you know anything about Greek, you know what Theos means. Antiochus considered himself a god. He gave no deference, no worship, no anything to any gods other than Zeus. He looked up to Zeus because he was from the Greeks. But the Syrian gods, the Egyptian gods, even Jehovah God, he paid no attention to. He didn't care anything for them. They would just as soon burn their temples as look at them. He tried to, by force, make all of those in the Seleucid Empire become Greeks. The Greek culture, you know anything about Greek culture? Greek culture is heavily wrapped up and heavily involved in paganism and idolatry and immorality. He tried to force the Jews to become that, and that was what offering that pig on the altar was all about. Verse 38 talks about the God of his fathers who he did not know. That's talking about Zeus. He shall deal with the strongest of fortresses with the help of foreign God. Those who acknowledge him he shall load with honor. He shall make them rulers over many and divide the land for a time. That is, those who would agree with Antiochus Epiphanes, he promoted. King of the north again defeated the king of the south in the battle, verse 40. Verse 41, he shall come into the glorious land. What's the glorious land? Judah. Tens of thousands shall fall, but these shall be delivered out of his hand. Edom and Moab and the main part of the Ammonites. He shall stretch out his hand against the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. He shall become ruler of the treasures of gold and of silver and all the precious things of Egypt. And the Libyans and the Cushites shall follow in his train. The news from the east and the north shall alarm him. He shall go out with great fury to destroy and devote many to destruction. He shall pitch his palatial tents between the sea and the glorious holy mountain. He shall come to his end with none to help him. Notice verse 44. He's fighting with Egypt. It says, news from the east and the north shall alarm him. East and the north is back toward Seleucid area where he's from. There were a couple of his countries he ruled over who were rebelling. He went back to stop the rebellion. He pitches palatial tents between the sea and the glorious holy mountain. What's the sea? Mediterranean. What's the holy mountain?
Jerusalem.
Mount Zion. On his way back to Jerusalem, on his way back through, he pitched his tent on his trip between the Mediterranean Sea and Jerusalem. That's where his army was. Then he went back home, and he shall come to his end with none to help him. Antiochus Epiphanes died in 163 BC. And he really got defeated by a little old small army from a little old nation called Judah. And I can't prove it, but I think God had something to do with it.
Roger,
Yeah.
you know, if Antiochus was the little horse,
Was what?
Do you know if Antiochus was the little horn that was mentioned?
Yes.
Okay.
Daniel chapter 9, the little horn. That is Antiochus Epiphanes. Chapter 8, chapter 9, chapter 10, and chapter 11 talk about the same time period, just from a little bit different perspective. And this chapter is more specific about Antiochus Epiphanes. And when you hear what's happening to the Jews, when you hear what's happening to the temple, when you hear what's happening to a sow being offered on the altar, you understand why Daniel was so perturbed. Why he was so upset. Daniel had great respect and great honor for that temple. And to know that it was going to be so desecrated like that just had to upset him. Anyone have a question or comment? I probably didn't explain that very well, but it is, to me, Daniel chapter 11 is just an amazing chapter. Accuracy about what's going to happen. If, as we think, Daniel chapter 7 was written in about 530, Antiochus Epiphanes became ruler in 165. Oh, he took over Jerusalem 168. He became king in 173. So you take 530 and subtract 173 from it. Well over 300 years before any of these events occurred. And Daniel's prophecy is that specific. King of the north is going to come against the king of the south. The king of the north is going to win, and the king of the south is going to win, and they're going to go to battle again. The king of the south is going to win. The king of the north is going to win. There's going to be a king of the north come in who speaks with flattery, who's a despicable human being. In fact, I didn't mention this, but Antiochus Epiphanes was his name. The Jews called him Antiochus Epimanes. The word Epimanes means crazy. So they called him Antiochus the Crazy. He was an terrible human being, and especially those who did not want to go where he wanted them to go, do what he wanted them to do. And if it had not been for the Maccabees, the nation of Judah may have once again been lost to idolatry and paganism. This one little Jewish family, the Maccabean family, stood up and said, this ain't going to happen. Matthias Maccabeus and 5 of his sons reigned over Judah for some period of time until the Romans came in.
And do they reach out to Rome to help them?
Well, it eventually came down to there was a battle between two of the Maccabees. There were two Maccabees who both claimed to be rulers, and one of them decided he was going to appeal to Rome for help. And Rome actually originally came to Judah because they were invited. You think maybe the Jews regretted that? In fact, the first Roman general to enter Jerusalem was a man by the name of Pompey. And Pompey was met outside the city of Jerusalem by the high priest in his full regalia and welcomed Pompey in Jerusalem with open arms. It's oftentimes what happens. You know, a lot of times the wickedness doesn't sneak in the back door. We just open the front door and let them right in. No. They were a family, but they got, because of their devoutness and their being devoted to the law, they got a lot of people to connect with them and to be with them in their battle. Matthias Maccabeus was actually a priest. He was of the tribe of Levi. And his sons were as well. Anyone else? We'll look at chapter 12 next Sunday morning.